At the dawn of time, before mankind had learnt the secrets of technology, before we wrote down our history, our ancestors lived in caves, huddling together for warmth, hunting and gathering for their food. And it was in one of these caves that the first technology was invented. You see, one night, a stranger, taller than any mortal man, his face shadowed by a hood, approached the cave. And he proudly announced to early man that he would gift them a secret knowledge, a secret power, that they might rival the gods themselves. This stranger named himself Prometheus, and he taught early man how to make fire. You see, it's tools and technology that really set humanity apart from the rest of the animals. And there is one tool, one technology that stands above the rest. Fire was a game changer to early man. It lit up the darkness. It held back the cold, and in an instant, banished two of our oldest enemies. Prometheus taught early man how to use fire to cook food, to boil water and make it safe, and later to forge metal ore into tools and weapons. But fire is dangerous. As useful as it is, it has a tendency to spread beyond our control, to burn and to consume everything it can reach. And yes, it is dangerous, but there is an undeniable allure to it. And it did not take early man long to learn that if you play with fire, you will get burnt. To keep the fire from burning them and everything they held dear, a few humans became the keepers of the fire. Their job was to understand this powerful force, this incredible technology, and harness it for the good of all. Since then, we have almost entirely tamed fire. Today, we can use a lighter at any time to conjure some small fire. It won't burn us, it won't burn anything down unless you're really dumb. We still use fire to generate electricity. We use it to propel our vehicles. We have little tiny fires inside our cars that make them go. And we still use it to cook. But what does all of that have to do with us who work in the modern tech industry? What's the relevance to today? That myth of Prometheus is pretty neat. I think I did a good job. But why am I out here telling you guys about that? You see, fire is the primeval technology, and it is a symbol for all technology. This story of learning some new knowledge, some new tech, and then getting burnt by it is something that has repeated itself again and again and again and again throughout human history. And in the modern day, we don't have fire keepers per se. We have us. We are the fire keepers. We make technology safe for everyone to use and harness this power for the good of all. So yes, my name is Omar. And today we're going to be talking about tech, how we've been burnt before by it, and how we can avoid being burnt again in the future. We're going to be doing this in the form of some technological fables. So we're going to have some stories just like that one, and there's going to be a lesson at the end of each one. And finally, before the end, we're going to talk about how you can apply these lessons in your day-to-day job. And yes, that is my favorite picture of myself. So yeah, without any further ado, let's jump into our first fable. So long ago in ancient China, there were a group of people, a group of fire keepers per se, who were working on something that they thought would change the world. They were alchemists, you see, and as alchemists do, they were trying to invent the elixir of immortality. Unfortunately, they didn't quite get there. People still die, so yeah. However, they did come up with this mixture of charcoal, niter, and sulfur, which resulted in a dark, grimy powder. And when you burnt this powder, it sparkled. It made pretty lights, and it was pretty fun. But when you mixed it in just the right ratio, you got everything perfect. It went boom. You see, what they invented was gunpowder, and we still use a form of it today, actually. But it wasn't all about explosions. That was not what they were going for in the start. In fact, initially, it was used as an accelerant to make starting a fire easy. Later on, they used it as a novelty. They used it in fireworks and little sparklers, and they made pretty lights, and they were like, this is fantastic. We can't live forever, but at least it can look good. But finally, they used it as a weapon. You see, gunpowder was refined. They made it safer, more powerful, not quite safe, but extremely powerful. And they used it in early firearms. They used it in bombs, and they used it in other instruments of war, like cannons. And instead of being something that would let everyone live forever, it became a tool to kill. But explosions can also be used for good. In fact, to this day, we use controlled explosions to dig mines. We use it to dig wells. We use it to clear rubble. It's really useful. So we cannot stop the technology we make from being used for evil purposes. But we can try and be thoughtful of how the tech we work with might be misused, and build ways to mitigate against them. And to talk about this, I want to speak about a different form of incendiary device. Let's talk about the internet, where flame wars abound. The internet it's almost ordinary to us today, right? We use it for everything. In fact, there's a bunch of you watching this talk right now online. But like gunpowder, this was initially restricted to a small cabal of secret intellectuals. It was just a handful of scientists sharing their notes and their files and their research with each other, and they had no idea how big it was going to get. But it did get bigger. It grew beyond just these few intellectuals sharing research notes and files, and became a giant pillar on which modern society stands. And with new possibilities came new dangers. You see, with almost unlimited sharing came almost unlimited problems. And the usual things, we're all familiar with them, right? People began using the internet to spread their vile ideologies. They began using it to run black market at a scale that they could not before, if anyone can just click and buy whatever. They even used it to do things that I won't talk about today because this is a family-friendly talk. With gunpowder, it was kept safe mostly through monopolizing it to the alchemists, who mostly worked for the government. But today, we primarily make tech for the crowds. We make tech for as many people as possible, because that's how we make money. So clearly, this approach will not work. Let me repeat that more directly. Trying to restrict the dangers of technology by limiting who can use it does not work. There is no security through obscurity. It's not possible. And in fact, even those alchemists who had access to the secret knowledge still got burnt by their own projects. The oldest text we have describing them describe them as having burnt hands and burnt visages, which is a fancy word for face, I learned. And their whole houses are occasionally burnt down. So yeah, there's no keeping it safe that way. We can't just say, okay, only the special few get to use it. So if we can't do that, what does work? And this takes some thinking. And if you guys have spoken with anyone from our ATC team, you'll know that the answer is, it depends. If there were some one-size-fits-all solution, our jobs would be way, way, way easier. In fact, I wouldn't be here speaking to you all. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Let's just maybe come up with some guidelines. We'll weigh up the pros and cons, and we'll see what we can do. The first thing you should do to make sure that your code is safe or your tech is safe for people to use is simply implement good security protocols. Because there's a surprising overlap between making sure people can't do criminal things or things you don't want them to do, with making sure people can do morally good things, good with a capital G. And this is one of those cases where good software in a technological sense is good software in a moral sense. So what we're going to talk about here is the principle of least privilege, which simply states that you should give your users as little permissions as possible to make sure that they can't access anyone else's data or do anything evil. What we want to do specifically is we want to railroad our users. We want to make sure they can only use our platform, our website, our app, or whatever for what we plan for them to use it for. But that's not always the case. You see, sometimes the application is incredibly broad. If you work on something that sells vouchers, sure, it's pretty easy to limit it to, we just sell vouchers. You can't do anything evil with that. Or can you? Right? So money laundering is a big problem. And people will use these vouchers, buy them at a discount, maybe through some means that they can clean up their dirty money. So how do we limit against this? How do we work against this? And we're going to take another concept from security here, which is penetration testing. Or to simplify it here, we're just going to role play a bad actor. We're going to don a black hat, and we're going to say, what is the most evil thing I can do with the app I work with today? And then you're going to go out and try to do that. And now that you've done that, you'll know where are the holes to patch up. Simple, right? But what do you do when it doesn't work? When you've done everything you can to make sure this tech you work with is safe and it is morally good and all that jazz, what do you do next? What do you do when everything's on fire and it blows up in your face? We'll talk about that later. Don't worry. So this last section was a little bit wishy-washy. We're going to get into something that is more washy-washy. Let's talk about the invention of the washing machine. It's really important, trust me. So it was important not because it made our clothes cleaner. We knew how to do that before, right? In fact, some of us still wash by hand, when the power is out. But prior to the invention of the washing machine, a large population of people's time was dedicated to washing your clothes by hand. You'd have to go draw water from a well or go down to the stream with your wash basket, and it took a really long time. And when I say people, I don't mean people. Specifically, I mean women, because back then, we believed that, men had to go out and do jobs and win bread and other misogynistic ideas, and apparently women can't do that. So they were washing the clothes. But around the year 1900, specifically it was patented in 1909, an unknown person submitted a patent for the electric washing machine and then disappeared. We don't know who invented it. We just know somebody registered it, they used the company name, so we don't know their actual name, and they changed our society forever. You see, because if you are not spending your time washing clothes, if you're not doing mundane chores all weekend long and all week long, you can be more productive. You can go out there and seek to do things that genuinely you feel passionate about. If you aren't doing laundry, you can be a poet, or a scientist, or an artist, or a programmer, or whatever else it is that you want to be. And for women in the 20th century, it turns out what they wanted, what they were passionate about, was equal rights, at least in America. You see, as a direct consequence of the washing machine, and as a direct consequence of having extra time, women were like, wait, why don't we have equal rights? Why can't we vote, at least in America? And they went out, they protested, and they got what they deserved. And this is just one example of how the technology we have, when leveraged towards a good with a capital G purpose, can change the world. And that's all great. But it didn't quite happen like that immediately. You see, like any new technology, the washing machine was not cheap. It was ridiculously expensive. And only the wealthiest few could afford it. And it quickly became monopolized as a way to make profit. And the word laundromat became introduced to the dictionary, and laundromats became very popular. So women were free from doing their chores every week. But instead, they had to go get low-paying jobs, generally. And the washing machine became a tool not to liberate people, but to extract money from poorer people for their time. And this is how technology always goes, right? We can't stop the march of capitalism. I'm not here to talk to you about communism today, maybe next year. But we can try and mitigate this. You guys have all heard of the digital divide, right? It's this idea that there are some people who can afford, who have access to good technology, and they get more out of the tech than poor people do. And the washing machine was an early example of this digital or technological divide. And we can't stop this entirely, but we can mitigate this. We can do better, and we do better every day. And let's talk about how exactly we do that. So we mostly work on software that is expected to reach as many people as possible. But we get it wrong all the time. We make software that isn't performant. We write software that isn't accessible. Or we assume that users know and act the way we do. And this is another case where good software is good software. You see, when you write a performant app, you're making sure that it works for everybody. We recently had an issue on the project where I work on where a certain menu would load fine. It would load fine on my machine. You guys have all heard that one before. It would work fine on my mobile device. It would work fine on my coworkers' mobile devices. Then we happened to test on a really, really slow device, the lowest model we supported, and that page was entirely broken. And this is something we run into fairly often. Developers tend to get paid fairly well, so we have fairly nice phones. But not all our users do. In fact, the majority of our users are using mid-range and low-end phones. So I want you guys to specifically go out and make your software as performant as possible. Make it reach as many people as possible so that we aren't furthering this digital divide. And if you want to do that, you can use the dev tools on any modern browser, and they'll let you simulate slow internet or slow devices or slow processing speed. So there's really no excuse not to do it. The next thing I want to talk about is something that is super important, and you're going to see a bunch of colors on the screen. And what we're going to talk about now is accessibility. Accessibility is a must. It is not optional, as much as your clients might want you to believe that it is. You have to do it. And it's super easy to become accessible. So what I've got a picture of here is a website called Wave. And what it does is you pass it in an HTML page, and it will pop up all the errors or all the things you've done right in terms of accessibility. It's literally just Control-V, paste your website, and click one button, and it shows you what's wrong, how to fix it, why it's bad. So there's really no excuse not to write accessible software. And there are dozens of these tools for anything that you might be making. The next one is one I often ignore, and a lot of people ignore. What you've got on screen is Netflix in my native language of Arabic. You see, localization or internationalization, sometimes called I-18N, which is a really stupid shorthand, is an often forgotten aspect of making tech. But it is an important one, right? Because we, or at least I'm here in South Africa, and over here we have officially now 12 languages of the country. And by assuming that all our users know English, we are ignoring a large portion of our potential user base. You see, the reason I brought up Netflix is I love Netflix. I waste a lot of time. If I've ever been a little bit late on a ticket, I see one of my old managers in the crowd. Now you know why. But my mother hated Netflix when it came out. There weren't good subtitles. Everyone spoke too fast. She can understand English conversationally, but when you're watching something like Peaky Blinders, you're not going to understand anything. So yeah, my mom had real trouble with this. But recently, Netflix has made their entire app available in Arabic. There are subtitles for literally every show. And now my mother spends more time than I do on Netflix. It's incredible. You see, it really helps us reach a lot of people. But we don't really have the leverage or the power to make these decisions on our own. Some of us are managers. Some of us are directors of companies. Most of us are we work on the front lines. We're writing the code. We're doing the QA tests. We're designing the UX. And we can implement some changes at that level. But you can't implement an entire strategy. So what do you do when you've got a deadline and your client is saying, we need this now, screw the accessibility? Personally, I think there should be regulation around this, but there isn't just yet. But what you can do is remind them that this will expand their user base, and they'll make more money off of it. Remember, we're in this industry to make money. At least a lot of us are. And on the topic of money, let's talk about our next section for this talk, which is the invention of the slot machine. I didn't know about the venue when I wrote this one, but it's real nice. So yes, slot machines are specifically designed to make money. And they weren't invented, but the modern iteration was made by the man you see on screen now. It was a man named Charles Fay in 1895. He made the first iteration of a modern slot machine, the kind that has 3 reels that would show different symbols, and you put it right, you get 777, ding, 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 you've won a lot of money. Back then, a lot of money was 10 nickels in his original design, which I put it through some online website, and that comes up to about $18 today, or 350 Rand. Not exactly the big jackpot we're all envisioning winning. You see, but it didn't need it to be. It just needed to be addictive enough to get people coming back. It needed to hit that dopamine to make them excited so they would spend more money on his machine. It needed to feel like you could win at any moment, but you couldn't. In fact, I hope all of you know that gambling is mostly a scam, and the house always wins. But how does the house win? You see, Charles Fay was an intelligent man. He thought about this, and he made his machine programmable in a way. Each reel had a set number of symbols, and you could adjust these because they were just playing cards back then. And you could adjust them to make sure that you would always make back more money than you lost. And if you thought people were losing too much and they're getting discouraged, you could adjust the odds in their favor again. And in this way, the people who owned these slot machines became incredibly wealthy until it got regulated. Then they were just, normally wealthy, but still really, really, really rich, piles of money. And this is just one example of what we in the modern day call a dark pattern, which is really dramatic name. Specifically, this one is called sneaking. And all of these dark patterns are put on a website that was invented by the man who came up with the term. His name was Harry Brignall, and he was a UX designer and a professor at a university, forget which one. These days, he calls them deceptive patterns. Apparently, people didn't buy into the drama. I think dark patterns is way cooler. I want to imagine Sauron himself making them. But specifically, he defined it as a user interface that has been deliberately designed to trick users into doing things that they may not want to do, such as subscribing them to hidden costs, or making them gamble without knowing the odds, or straight up lying to them about the odds. And these dark patterns are everywhere today. There's a section on this website that will show you where, but I'm just going to show you one today, which is LinkedIn. We all use LinkedIn, right? Or at least I used it once, got a job, and never used it again. And I would have loved to unsubscribe from the email, because I get emails 3 times every day telling me, so-and-so has viewed your profile. Don't you want to subscribe? We've got a special offer for you. But to unsubscribe from LinkedIn takes at least 64 clicks. At least 64. I don't know about you guys, but I don't have the time to do that. I'm too busy doing things like signing up for stressful talks. So yeah, this is one example of a dark pattern. And not all dark patterns are as obvious or as evil as hidden odds on a slot machine. But they are everywhere, from LinkedIn to Takealot to Microsoft. And there's a whole section. You guys should go check it out. But why do designers use dark patterns? I've met some of the designers we have at the company. They're not all sitting in a dark room cackling about how they're going to trick people. Or if you guys are, please invite me. That sounds cool as hell. No, we use dark patterns because they are incredibly, incredibly effective at driving up metrics such as user engagement or user signups. And that's what we're going for. We're trying to make money in this industry, or at least our clients are. And sometimes when you are a UX developer, it can be a little bit hard to tell whether something is intentionally manipulative or if it's just a good design pattern. Sometimes you stumble across gold and it just works. You see, we are often immersed in the stuff that we make, so we don't get to see it from a fresh pair of eyes. And there are some patterns which are dark patterns in one case, but not in another. So for example, if you were to block the entire screen with a pop-up saying you must sign up before you read this article, I hate that. That's a dark pattern. You're forcing the user to do something just so that they can use your content. But it becomes entirely different if, last week, my computer popped up with a message saying, you must change your password. Same tool, different context, suddenly it's not a dark pattern, it's doing something good. It's enforcing our security rules, and that's something important. So how do you tell the difference? And the first thing you need to do is educate yourself. There's a whole list of the types of deceptive pattern. They've been made up by a university professor, so I assume he knows his stuff. I've certainly noticed a lot of these. And you just learn about them. Look at their examples. See if any of the stuff you work with looks like that. The next thing you should do is called dog fooding, or eating your own dog food. Obviously, as part of the design process, you need to go through user testing. You go out, you let a bunch of people use your app for a bit, and you ask them, how did you like it? But you should also be a user of your own app. Not to look for bugs, or not to just check that it works, but simply to make sure that it's designed for people, that there's nothing there that annoys you. This process is called dog fooding because it's named after an ad where a president of a dog food company fed his own dog the dog food he was selling to tell you that it was safe, because back then they didn't have regulations and you could feed your dogs anything. So yeah, go out there, use your own software as a user. The next thing I want to talk about is this man on screen now. His name is Alfred Nobel, and he was also a firekeeper of sorts. He also tried to make technology safe for people. You guys have probably heard of him. But for those of you who haven't, Nobel's most important invention was this thing we call dynamite. It's an explosive using nitroglycerin, and it was patented in 1867. Specifically, it's a safe version of nitroglycerin. In fact, Nobel wanted to call it Nobel Safety Powder. Thank God he didn't go with that name, it's awful. Instead, he used the Greek word for power, dynamos, and he came out with dynamite. And it was a world-changing invention at the time, right? It was an explosive that could be carried safely. It was more powerful, it was less volatile. It didn't go boom if you let it in the sun. It didn't go boom if you bumped it wrong. It didn't go boom if you put it on a train. You see, Nobel wanted to make a really powerful explosive. One, for the prosperity. We mentioned earlier that it can be used to open up mines and dig tunnels for trains and all of this good stuff. And Nobel was actually a staunch pacifist. But as you know, dynamite is not only used for good things. It is not only used for safe things. Nobel also hoped that if this prosperity brought about by the dynamite didn't fix the world's problems and bring about more peace, just the sheer horror of these giant explosions would stop people. But that wasn't the case. We still use explosives today. In fact, there are multiple active wars. There is currently a war in my homeland of Sudan where they are constantly bombing the civilians. What Nobel envisioned was something called mutually assured destruction. And it is something that became about later with nuclear weapons, where people said, okay, we're not going to use that. It's too bad. Slow down. Let's not get that bad. But we still have war. So Nobel was an abject failure in his goal of bringing about world peace. And he knew this one day when a newspaper in France published his obituary by mistake. In 1888, it said a French newspaper wrongly celebrated that Nobel was dead. Specifically, the headline they used is, "The Merchant of Death is dead." And this horrified Nobel. You see, he was a staunch pacifist. He really wanted to do good. And this entire newspaper really made him rethink his life. He had obviously made a ridiculous amount of money off of dynamite because it's so useful. And he didn't want to be known as the guy who profited off of people's demise. He didn't want people to celebrate his death. No one wants that. And so he endeavored to bring about some change, to try and undo the evil he brought back into the world. And to do that, he settled on making a prize for people who advanced the sciences of physics, chemistry, medicine, as well as literature. I don't know why that one's a science. And finally, he gave one to the person who has done the most or the best to advance fellowship amongst nations, the abolition or reduction of standing armies, and the establishment and promotion of peace congresses amongst nations, which is a real mouthful. We just call it the Nobel Peace Prize these days. You see, when we make mistakes, there is no Control-Z button. We can't undo it. If users' data leaks, we can't unleak it. If someone uses our app to commit a crime, we can't roll back that commit. So what do we do then? And like earlier, the answer is, it depends. The solution will be different depending on what the mistake was. But the first thing, and a general good guideline here, is to simply be open. Admit your mistakes. Be honest with users and work towards a solution. But the most important thing you should do is talk about what went wrong. Analyze what went wrong. Write down, how did we get here? How are we going to make sure we won't do it again? And when I say write it down, I mean write it down. Write an article, write a postmortem, share it to other people. Read other companies' postmortems. Every day, or at least multiple times a week, I read a postmortem from some other company saying, oh, this is how our services went down, or, oh, this is how we leaked user data. This morning, I was reading one about user security. Somebody got scammed out of an MFA code. And by reading these things, you understand what to avoid, and you can learn from the mistakes of others so that you don't need to make those mistakes yourself. All right, in the title of this talk, I promised I would talk about ChatGPT. I said I'd talk about AI and neural networks and all of that stuff. So let's do it. This is ChatGPT. This is a website. You guys have probably seen it. You've probably heard of it. It's a generative AI that you can talk to like a human, and it will talk back like a human through magic. But how did it get so smart? Some of us are clued in, some of us aren't. So I'm going to talk about it. You see, ChatGPT is a magic hat or a black box that is trained on a bunch of data and spits out human-like text. But what do I mean when I say data, right? Because it takes a lot of data to do this. And what does that data look like? That data looks something like this. There's a tool on OpenAI's website where you can see the tokens that it makes. Tokens are abstract fragments of text. There are little bits, and what ChatGPT does is it learns a statistical mapping of how one token follows after the other. You guys have got autocomplete on your phones, I assume. ChatGPT is just the world's fanciest autocomplete, nothing more. It's actually a lot more, but it doesn't sound good for the talk. But where do they get these tokens from? What did they train on? The answer is they got it through piracy. One of the biggest sources for NLP training data is a corpus of books, and these books include both things in the public domain and things that are not in the public domain. It includes a whole bunch of news articles that OpenAI do not have permissions to use. And it can be reproduced fairly easily, getting it to spit out something that is verbatim the words in a book. Now, the legality of this is still being debated, and the ethics of this is still being debated. We have other generative AIs, not for words, but for pictures. We've got things like DALL-E and Stable Diffusion. In fact, I use Stable Diffusion for almost all of these slides. I'm sure you guys have noticed. And like I said, legally and ethically, this is still getting debated. There's a hot discussion. So what do we do when we have no precedent? There's no people who have fought for this legally before us. We don't know what the morals are here. It's real murky. And now we're going to get to the entire point of this talk. And it can be summarized by a quote from my favorite documentary. It's one you might have heard of. It's called Jurassic Park. In this documentary, there is a doctor, Dr. Ian Malcolm, who says to the people running the park that your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. Now, I'm no Luddite. I don't hate tech. I love it. I work in the industry. But we do need to be thoughtful of the things we do and the things we make. How can the stuff we work on harm people? How can we be better? How can we do better to make sure that our technology is used for the good of all? We are the firekeepers of the modern day, after all. We don't want anyone to get burnt. So let's talk about that. Let's summarize everything down into some nice little guidelines that you guys can take home today. The first thing you need to do is think through how your tech might be used for evil. Wear that black hat, like I said earlier, and do the most harm you can, then mitigate against it. And repeat, and repeat, and repeat. Do it again and again and again until you are watertight. Next, make your technology as accessible as possible. Do not exclude people on unnecessary and made-up things such as nationality, race, or how rich you are, or whether you are differently abled or not. Test with performance tools like the one I showed you. Another one that I like is maybe not role-playing disabled users, but try and empathize with them. Use your app with a screen reader for a day. See how hard it is. I have. It's hella difficult. Next thing we need to do is avoid dark patterns. Our users are not puppets. We do not need to manipulate them. If we make good software, they will come to us. Even if these dark patterns are super effective, yeah, avoid them. Regularly eat your own dog food. Try out your own app and make sure that you aren't making bad software. Finally, when things go wrong, let people know. And if things are going wrong and your higher-ups don't want to let anyone know, become a whistleblower. Here in South Africa, at least, we've got the Protected Disclosures Act of 2000, and there are similar whistleblowing laws all around the world. Offer reparations to your users, fix the bugs when they come up, and just be open in general and learn from your mistakes. Finally, and if you come away with this talk with one thing and one thing only, I want you guys to be thoughtful and compassionate. All of this stuff comes from a place of love, as cringy as that sounds. We are all human. We all care about each other. We need to be empathetic. So go out there, be thoughtful, and make good software. Thank you, guys.